thank you guys all for coming. My name is Matthew Mosler. I'm a journalist. I cover the Fed and the U.S. economy for Bloomberg News, so I'm pretty excited to be here moderating this panel because we have a lot of topics that I think you'll find are both near and dear to what I do and are very relevant to the entire policy discussion right now. So Warren Mosler is going to get us started off, and he's presenting a paper by Giacomo Bracci, who is an economist at the University of Trento. He could not be with us today, which is why Warren is presenting, and I suppose Warren probably doesn't need much introduction among this crowd, but author of Soft Currency Economics, The 7 Deadly Innocent Frauds of Economic Policy, and of course, a longtime pioneer of modern monetary theory. And then after that, we're going to hear from Daniele Basciu, who is with ReteMMT Italia, and he's going to talk about full employment and price stability, and look at some employer of last resort policies and sort of compare that with the more traditional approaches. And then Linwood Tauheed, who is, of course, a professor here at UMKC, is going to talk about development and ways in which governmental entities that do not issue their own currencies can still finance economic development. And then finally, we have Panayotis, Giannoakouros, who is going to look at the role of econometrics in modern monetary theory. So with that, I'll turn it over to Warren, get us started. We'll do 15 minutes for each presentation, then we'll open it up to Q&A. So thanks again.
Okay, Giacomo's in Trento, and be here. I've got the latest draft of the paper, so if anybody wants a copy, warren.mosler@gmail.com, and I'll get you an electronic. I'll get you an email copy or a link to it. Okay, this is about the. Taxation and the non-neutrality of money. And the abstract, the introduction, what I've done is taken segments of it, what I think are some of the highlights, and then I'll give a brief discussion of each slide. How much time do I have?
15 minutes. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Okay. Paper shows how the introduction of taxation as a coercive non-market mechanism imposed by the government and the private sector necessarily obviates any notion of neutrality with regards to the screen is too big, so yeah, I get this out of the presentation back to the other one.
All right. Hey Warren, we're more on the ball than we thought we were.
Oh, you do?
Yeah.
All right, well, that's all I have to. Any notion with regards to the government's currency. So what we're saying is, in the first instance, you have coercive taxation. How can the currency possibly be used for something such as taxation? So the paper begins with a selection of models, general equilibrium models that assume the neutrality of money. They recognize that in general, monopoly and other introductions of imperfect competition can alter real outcome. However, they fail to recognize the currency itself as an introduction of imperfect competition. Now, the interesting thing is all the models used by central banks today, general equilibrium models, assume that money is neutral. What does that mean? I'll get into it. Neutrality of money means that if you change the amount of money, you do anything with the money, it doesn't change real outputs. They're two separate stories, money story and real output story. Real output is based on productivity, number of people working, employment, all kinds of available resources, but changing the money just changes prices. Double the money supply, you double prices, for example, that type of thing. And so they all the models assume at least long-run neutrality, and some of them short-run neutrality, and some of them short-run non-neutrality. Well, what we're saying is it's not possible to have any semblance of neutrality. Yet that's what's guiding all monetary policy right now. So, Section 2 surveys and contributions, historical contributions. Here you go. Real economic variables are not affected by monetary variables, as Giacomo points out. Okay. This is just a review of what's in the paper. Section 4 focuses on the MMT approach, also known as Charlist. Section 5 concludes. Historical context. It's a typical assumption in the macroeconomic models of the new economic consensus. But the roots of this lie in the beginning of history of economics. It's been intertwined with debates on the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy, stabilization of employment. If money doesn't matter, why are you doing all these things? How can fiscal policy matter if money doesn't matter? How can monetary policy do it? So those are the types of discussions that mainstream has been involved in. And then he goes into some of the historical aspects of it. It assumes that the price vector is just from labor market, good markets clear. That's in the absence of money. Money does not enter into an agent's utility function. Since it's intrinsically worthless, and therefore in these models, the savings should not exist. Why would you save something that's intrinsically worthless? At the end of any time period, you want it down to zero. You do have money to spend. The challenge that appears is this: the best developed model of the economy cannot find room for it, which is the row model or relative value model. Model that was on in 1982. So the models don't have any room for money in them or currency. Finite time horizon to complete useless fiat money should never be saved by economic agents. This is a history of the whole concept. Development of thought, mainstream thought. The lack of logistical starting point for the acceptability of the currency creates a problem of infinite regression. If it's not convertible into anything, what's it worth then? Why is it worth anything? Well, because somebody else will take it. Why will he take it? Somebody else will take it. That's the idea of infinite regression, which does not support anything. The idea that monetary variables can be analyzed separately is a longer concept term than classical dichotomy. So that they can have two things. They've got money and then they have the real economy. Okay, here we go. Short run, non-neutrality. They have to have at least this, or you can't say that monetary policy or fiscal policy is going to do it. It's generally known by Friedman to the effect of adaptive expectations, which makes government policies only temporarily useful. The people in the Fed will tell you, yes, we expect this to increase demand, but it's because we're moving demand forward. They're not just net doing it because they've got this neutrality assumption. Or the opposite. We're slowing things down, but it gets put off to later. In the long run, performance is going to be based on productivity and resources. Support for this is also provided by Lucas 1972. Again, they have to come up with some reason. They can observe that changing things does make a difference, and they try to figure out why, and this is what they come up with. See policy effectiveness. This is Giacomo reviewing things here. Real business cycle models endorse complete neutrality of money. Whereas the Keynesians allowed for short run non-neutrality due to the existence of friction such as rigidity in the labor markets, sticky prices, past that thing that's clogging it up. Now, depending on your politics, and most of the people there, it would be like a labor union, or wages won't adjust or something like that. That's why markets won't quit. Keynes rejects neutrality. And he does it for almost for different reasons. Okay. Again, what he's saying is that if money was neutral, you wouldn't have the booms and busts to begin with. So it's obviously not neutral. That's why we're happy, because things are just clear all the time. So he starts with that premise. But the point is here that one of the Keynesian revolutions or whatever, the difference is about money, monetary policy, fiscal policy not being neutral. The increase in importance due to negative profit expectations or any cause of uncertainty can translate into lower sales for businesses. So what he's saying is currency does matter, because if people don't spend, then you get no sales, no output. Now that is under consumption, by the way, from 1589 or something. All of that shows. Post-Keynes is taking it to mean that no neutrality is possible both in the short run and the long run. Paul Davidson is Baldwin. Could I have him speak directly? According to which money matters in the determination of real outcomes, which is non-neutrality. Two main reasons. The use of money provides a buffer against uncertainty. This is a reason to save it, right? And money denominated purchasing power created by the banking system, which is also indirectly about savings, because the banking system can't make a loan, create a deposit, unless somebody wants to hold that deposit. In the first instance, it's a borrower. In the second instance, it's whoever you want to get it from, so on down the line. So at the end of the line, there's always a saver in there. And so what you've got is credit expansion in the banking system adding to aggregate, giving funding savings desires, which is the reason for the low aggregate. And he draws on the liquidity preference to argue that non-neutrality is historic value. So you have all these properties of money which cause people not to spend, to hoard, whatever, which changes outcomes. Therefore, it's not neutral. In fact, it's critical. Monetary circuit, again, money's entirely critical, because the story starts off with businesses have to borrow from the bank to pay their workers. They can't do this, it doesn't happen, so money becomes, their model is a critical part of it. Again, public non-neutral. So what Giacomo is doing is he's going through the history of how this is looked at. And what we're adding to this is that the imposition of taxes itself, which immediately creates a population of unemployed private sector agents, means there can't possibly be such thing as neutrality. It's the opposite. Interesting here, models that assume neutrality, the central bank models, recognize that in general, monopoly and other imperfections can alter real outcomes. Ironically, they fail to recognize the currency itself as the introduction of perfect competition, and therefore a first elimination of neutrality. And the role of taxation. And there are other, this is 1974. Okay, I didn't write soft currency economics until 1992. So, and this whole idea that the demand for money is created by taxation has been around for a while. It's just never been part of the general dialogue. Fiscal theory of the price level has been trying to do this. They've missed the point that the paper on that. And I want to close. Oh. And I want to close with just a quick comment on this debate that's been going on for a long time, this academic debate between Keynes and the classics, it's called. The classics said you cannot have unemployment without a monopoly. And they would point to either a labor union or inclusion in businesses as the cause of monopoly, stealing prices of wages. Any imperfect competition is what causes unemployment. Keynes said no. You can have unemployment even without anything like that because of what goes on in the currency. You talked about importing and aggregate demand and whatnot. And so the classics saying you can't have unemployment without a monopoly. Keynes saying yes, you can have unemployment without a monopoly. Describing the country. What Keynes described in currency is a monopoly. Okay. So the classics were right. You can't have unemployment without a monopoly. Keynes was right. There's something in the money that was costing it, but it was a monopoly. So they're talking past each other for 80 or 90 years now. And so if you ever hear that come up in any of the academic debates, just you can straighten them out for me. Okay, thank you very much. Background when I was in Italy at Bloomberg a couple of years ago, 2 months. And the other, Stefano took me around, the others from ReteMMT took me around. We did 45 presentations in 60 days up and down Italy. Giacomo, who wrote the paper, he's one of my, he translate for me. So, I noticed one thing that was hurting Italian productivity, and that was if I said something in English, it would take about 5 seconds, about 10 seconds to say it in Italian.
Sicilian dialect, there is no future tense. Which makes it hard to get things done if you can't say this in the future.
Good morning. And first of all, sorry for my English that is bad and a bit rusty. Okay, I'm the president of the scientific committee of ReteMMT. Italia is an association of activists. We are present in 2 nations now, in Italy and in Spain and spread MMT concepts into unions, media, and universities, and so on. This paper points out some reflections about full employment and price stability, as designed by Warren Mosler in his paper of about 20 years ago. So, like in the movie of Woody Allen, Warren, feel free to tell me that I didn't know anything about your work. Okay, the first point, savings not offset cause unemployment in monetary economy. Savings are normal in a monetized economy, and the net financial assets by the monopolies can accommodate savings and allow full employment in every moment. And selling at a fixed price, currency in exchange for hours of work, as much as customers desire. Customers are unemployed. Okay. Full employment, we see full employment as a primary target for ethical reasons and as anchor of price stability. Okay. What are the main points? It relies on public deficits and creation of net financial assets, okay, that are function of full employment. That is, the state targets the full employment and then create the necessary net financial assets. It's oriented to public purpose and doesn't involve, it should not involve significant increase in consumption of not renewable resources. Okay. And this is important, the program of full employment must be structured with universal access. That is, all people able to work and looking for a job should access to the program. We can see in the structure of in the framework of full employment and price stability similar points to the condition where a monopolist supplier of public services has got the duty to guarantee a minimum standard of the supply good at a fixed price. We can see this in water, electricity, gas managed under public authorities. Okay. In the MMT world and post-Keynesian world, we have several definitions of what is full employment. There is a range between a high level, optimal full employment, that is all those needing to work to attain a socially normal, long-run consumption expectations, are able to get a job, providing them with enough income, either from the private sector under normal conditions or from the state. This is a high level of full employment. But there is, we said, a range, and full employment in full employment and price stability shows a scheme with a minimum wage labor standard that is a lower level, but above the misery minimum wage. So this is the proposal, and it's intended for generic unskilled workforce, and MMT activists should be honest with people. That is, full employment in this proposal is not the job of your dreams. Okay, it's a generic unskilled job for public purposes, and it could result in underemployment respect to individual specific competencies of unemployed people. Okay. We have the set case in Eurozone and Italy. The Euro system is rooted in austerity. The European Central Bank can't offset directly savings and doesn't guarantee officially government deficits. Okay, savings not offset cause unemployment. The system could be technically arranged, but at the moment it's a robot. It's an automaton out of a political discussion. Okay, it's structured onto exported leadings, the whole system, and it's doing its job. What if a state, for example, Italy, exited from the euro system? Italy faces a grave problem. That is, these are 3 articles of the Italian constitutional law. The first article states that the Italian Republic is founded on work, and workers have the right to a decent living wage. This is the first article of our constitutional law. The Italy guarantees and supports savings. And the third point from 5 years ago, Italy targets a balanced budget. That is foolish. Okay. So we have this situation in Italy, where at least one of them at least one of them must be killed. Okay. They cannot live at the same moment, all of them. Some reflection about past and actual alternative tools. Unemployment, we have had unemployment even in phases of economic growth in Italy, and it has been used as a disciplinary tool, as normally we see everywhere in the world. The alternative tools has been fiscal relaxations, official and not official, to stimulate business sectors involving high private debt and high use of unskilled workers, typically the building sector. Okay. Solution that we called INBI, that is the contrary of not in my back years. That is regions with high unemployment and weak environmental systems accept highly polluting enterprises with low ecological standards in order to attract enterprises and hire people. Okay. And the last, unconventional monetary policies like quantitative easing. In all of these tools, full employment is a collateral effect. It's not the main target. And we see that we have public deficits oriented to stimulate private deficits for private purposes, and an increase in consumption of not renewable resources. This is the situation of the building sector in Europe. We can say that there is no growing, no significant growth in the sector, and all these tools have hidden costs. For example, costs from facilitations in building sector lead to easy building licenses in areas with higher hydrogeological risks, and in a second moment, the damages from houses that have been built in weak environmental areas. The syndrome, please in my backyard, you can see here the translation. This is an enterprise that made damages to the environment, and there was we are 6 years ago between the need of employment for the region and the damages made by the company. Okay. 5 minutes. Third point, in depressed areas, criminal organizations play a sort of local monopolist role in the local money supply chain, selling currency at high price in exchange for hours of work sold by the unemployed buffer stock. Okay. I don't talk about quantitative easing because all of us, I think, know that it's not a tool targeting full employment. We propose here a comparison scheme between the three proposals: fiscal tolerance, quantitative easing, and the employer of last resort proposal. The employer of last resort proposal is rational for the state. So why does not the state apply the employer of last resort proposal? Because as the Nobel Prize Ernest Simon underlined, the state and every organization is not rational. Every organization, every big organization is a field of battle, okay, between different groups. So unemployment is rational for the group that controls the state. Currently, exporters are in charge. Governments, economy, media, so unemployment is rational for this group. And the full employment is the perpetual political issue that Kaleski underlined. The paradox is that unemployment of last resort role played by the state would remove class conflict in monopolist space and would make stronger the working class, but cannot be introduced if the working class is not politically strong enough. Two opposite risks about transitional job claims. In case of low workers replacement rate, transitional jobs could become permanent job, masking an endemic underemployment for disadvantaged groups and disadvantaged regions, cities, and so on. And the second, it is hopefully high workers replacement rate requires an high effort to plan and structure work programs, organizatively simple and compatible with the fast replacement of the involved workers. Okay. High organizative know-how and complexity should be excluded. By the way, first of all, the state should act as the director Sergio Leone, where full employment wins the triello, kills balanced budget, and orders government deficit to dig a hole as deep as necessary to find the treasury. Today, government digs like a straw, so it's quite simple. As long as the state has got the loaded gun. Okay. Thank you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Okay, let me see. This is topic is on the modern monetary theory and development. Modern monetary theory and development. That was an early title. It's going down a direction, but it's a little more focused. So here we are. I'll do this for. So the project has been motivated by two issues. One, there was a comment that was made some time ago on social media, and I forget the form, maybe New Economic Perspectives or maybe Capitalism, that MMT had little or nothing to say about development, or at least up to that time, had not. The second issue is the recent attempt by the state of California to sign into law single-payer healthcare system, which has been stalled over concerns about ability to pay. So those two issues. Now, it may be that MMT has not been thought of as having much to say about development because the emphasis in MMT on sovereign currency is thought to dismiss its implementation in most developing countries, since most developing countries, because of their colonial past, are still tying their currency to the past colonist currency. Therefore, they're not sovereign. Therefore, there's nothing they can do. Okay. Notable exceptions are China, India, and the U.S. as former colonies, and we might also note that they are all sovereign in their currency. So there is an opportunity to break away from that colonial past, right? Okay. So modern money theory argues that currency issuing governmental entity sovereign in its own currency can afford to pay for whatever it has the real resources to provide. You all know this. With monetary sovereignty and assuming such provisioning furthers development, defined broadly a la Murdahl as the upward movement of the entire social system, so I'm not putting any particular type of development in place. Money is no obstacle to development, okay? When applied to sub-entities within monetarily sovereign entities, for example, states within the US or countries within the EU, the conclusion is that these sub-entities, not being sovereign in their own currencies, are dependent on the flow of the sovereign's currency and utilizing their stock of resources. If, quote, real resources are not as limited as financial resources, such dependency constrains potential development. Okay, so I will argue that monetary dependency, which I will call coupling, trying to avoid all of the dependency literature, should not be viewed as all or nothing. Provisioning that a sub-entity can accomplish with complementary, in John Commons' language, stocks of resources can be decoupled from the currency's, sovereign's currency. In Commons' literature, complementary factors are those things that you need. If you have those things, if you need to do something, you have everything you need to do, you do it, okay? Now, and so a question to be answered is how much of the sovereign's currency is required for acquisition of limiting factors, those things that you don't have, you have to get from somewhere else. Limiting resources. And I begin to explore the construction of a number of indices useful towards answering this question. I then discuss the state of California's recent attempt to establish single-payer health care as a model of how such decoupling might be possible. It is assumed that some resources may be limiting and therefore complete decoupling may not be possible. Okay, and so here's a model. We're all familiar with this model in some sense. We have consumers, the C circle, producers, government, and investors. Consumers consume, government consumes, government spending. It also, see if I have a, yeah, okay, that didn't work. Okay, what I need is a laser, and this is supposed to be one. Maybe that's it. No. I apologize. Let me do this here. We go back. Anyone know how to do the laser on this thing? Yeah, I could do that. Let me see if my laser still has any juice in it. Okay, a little bit. So here we have a flow of from C to G of the taxes. This flow here is transfer payments, and so I am separating government spending that goes to productive units from transfer payments, right? I'm also looking at savings here and putting a arrow from the savings to the investor. That's called borrowing. And so we can separate savings from borrowing by arguing that borrowing is equal to investment right here, but savings and borrowing are not necessarily equal. So it expands the model. So we have the domestic sector in the large circle and in the foreign sector. And those arrows going from D, domestic, to foreign, are exports minus imports. And so we have, in the upper here, where do you see it? sectoral balances process. On the bottom, I have my modifications. That is, I'm adding transfer payments and borrowings, which changes the sectoral balances equation at the bottom a little bit, right there. Now, I have what I call circulation variables, which are C, consumption, and income. So circulation going on between producers and consumers. These are leakage variables, and these are injection variables, so they should be familiar with you. Now, what I'm going to do next is take this model and expand it. Everything is, on the domestic side, is the same. On the foreign side, the other entity, the entity outside, I want to know where those leakages and injections are going to come from, okay? And so there's an assumption here, complementary to what's going on over here, that, for example, there may be some investment from foreign entities, if I can see it, foreign entities into domestic production, okay? And other kinds of, this is the SD, the SF, in and out are savings transfers, remittances, and other kinds of things that might occur between two entities. We have other kinds of transfers. I have here in the large blue arrow and the large red arrow a connection that only kind of makes sense in one situation. Because I have consumers in the domestic entity paying a tax to a foreign entity. Like, for example, a state paying, consumers in the state paying taxes to the federal government. Right? I also have a return that is, I've got quote resource sharing where some of their tax dollars is returned back to the state, block grants and those kind of things. Okay, so I have that entity. So these two are coupled in the sense that they are not independent from each other. Right? Okay, and so the way that you read this is in CD to GD, that is CD to GD is a domestic tax payment. And that's what we would normally call just TX. TXD indicates the domestic tax payment. The CD to GF, which is a leakage, CD to GF, where is it? Let me see, I guess it's the second one. It should be, no, I'm sorry, it's this one here. I apologize, Mike, right? Is TXDF, taxes to domestic to foreign. Okay. So I'm not going to go through here anymore, but anyway, this is an expanded model. We're trying to take into account many of the flows that are X minus M. Now, I'm going to look at one index, and one indices of coupling would be, for example, a relationship of value X to the value of M. And we might look at that. If you can see this, I hope it's available. I have 6 different functional forms for such an index. For example, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and the value of those forms, the function is, for example, M over X, X over M, M minus X, X minus M, or X minus M minus X over M plus X, or X minus M over X plus M, different functional forms. And under different conditions, I'm going to look at the limits of the values. So when M equals X, this form is 1 is equal to 1, functional form 2 is equal to 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, the form is 0. When X is much greater than M, right, the functional form of 1 is 0, the functional form of 2 is infinite. And just go down to that same 1 and 2 when M is much greater than X, they reverse roles. I don't think that's good. Those are good characteristics for an index. 3 and 4, the functional forms are negative X to X or M to negative M. I also don't think those are very good indicator values. 5 and 6 give me some better indications of some better think, better for use in that they are limited from -1 to 1, but they reverse themselves depending on which of those forms you use. And so I am choosing, for example, index 6, which has the advantage of conveying the idea of D being coupled to F, dependent, right? The more negative the result, and being less coupled or decoupled from F, the more positive the result. So that's a possible index. There's another one that I won't have time to talk about. Okay. And so that would be the value of X minus N to the value of Y. Right? Imports minus exports to the entire economy. Won't have time. So now this is the model you saw before, right? And I'm going to put this into a scenario in which there's very little of a domestic economy. Most of the economy here is initiated from the outside. You might call this a colonial economy, in which there's foreign investment. There are workers who are being paid in this economy, but there's no domestic production as such. There's only this foreign production, which is for the purpose of the colonizer, and therefore anything that the workers here need, they have to buy, they have to export, or excuse me, they have to import everything that they purchase. There's no governmental spending as such. There is governmental control, and that governmental control is funded by a return of taxes. By the way, CD pays taxes to the foreign government. So all of this is happening in the foreign government's currency. There's no local currency. Okay. These are separate balance equations. And interestingly enough, after we get through this, we get to the point that X minus N then exports is a function of taxes. That is, taxes simply drain whatever might be left in the colonial economy, so there's no savings, right? It's a godly table for that scenario, and I'm not going to go through this. I guess you're all familiar with this. But the various transactions, the bank accounts for each of the entities, the consumer, the government, and so forth, and the transaction flows between them, which leads me to this Vensim model. Many of you might not be familiar with Vensim. It's a simulation tool. But all the rectangles are the stocks, the arrows are the flows, and this is just a model of the identities. There's no behavioral equations. And so what needs to be added to this are the behavioral relationship between flows and the value of initial conditions. For example, what determines how the consumer, the domestic consumer, distributes their income between consumption and taxation. How is that determined? What's the level of taxation and so forth and so on? Okay, so here's a second scenario. Now, what I've done in the second scenario is that I've added some governmental spending in the form of transfer payments, right? And taxation back to the local government, and then spending by the local consumer to local production. Right? Now, I'm going to argue that particular circulation has nothing to do with the sovereign's currency. Okay, it's simply being a made-up currency. With the condition being that that transfer payment going out to the consumer is used to pay for products produced locally. Products come back in, and then that all of that they're taxed away. So none of it stays in the system. There's no opportunity to save it. It's simply a transfer payment for consumption of local goods, and then it's taxed away. None of that has anything to do with the sovereign's currency. In fact, when you do the separate balance equations, you get the same result. There's no result monetarily for the entire system. That's all happening within the local system. Okay, and you might do that, for example, because you have unemployment in the local system and you need people to do something, and the local government can create its own currency. It doesn't have to borrow euros from a euro system. It can create its own currency. Many nations, many communities around the world are in fact doing this in the U.S. in the Eurozone because they can't get their hands on enough dollars or enough euros. Therefore, they're creating their local currency to put themselves to work. Okay? So, California single payer, go through this. The attempt was tabled by the Speaker of the California Assembly by saying, well, it's too expensive. And so even though California is not sovereign in U.S. currency, Greenback, does MMT have anything to say about California single payer funding? Okay, so in 2008, Governor Schwarzenegger issued IOUs, warrants, because the state had run out of money, issued warrants to vendors and employees and tax recipients, the funders. And it was a temporary situation. Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 of the U.S. Constitution forbids states from creating money, but these are warrants, and so they're interest-paying bonds in a sense. And so they did that temporarily. Let me see. Let me go back here. Okay. Okay, I don't have what I need there, but anyway. Now, California itself is about 40 million people, 1/8 the population of the U.S. It has a GDP of $2.2 trillion, is the 7th largest economy in the world, larger than France. If California was its own country, the answer to the question of sovereignty would be obvious, as long as it doesn't follow France's example. But even though California is a state, we can dream or model this going back to this. I'm not going to elaborate on this. But here we have a situation where we are back to a slim California model. That is, California, the end result of this is as long as California can find greenbacks to pay its tax burden. Because what happens with California, like many states, is it pays taxes, and what it gets back in revenue sharing is not what it pays, less than it pays. There are other states that get more back. So California is subsidizing. If California was its own economy and could supply everything it needed within California, the only greenbacks it would need is to pay the tax differential. Now, how would it get those is the question. And one way of getting those is to sell things. You sell things out of the territory, you get greenbacks. Now, that's a theoretical. Obviously, you need mechanisms for conversion of currency and other kinds of things. Now, to my knowledge, there's no academic research on this subject. Various commentators, Warren Mosler, Bill Mitchell, Scott Fulweiler, Ellen Brown, and others weighed in at the time on social media and the possibility of turning those warrants into money and making them acceptable for the payment of state taxes. One issue, among others, was to resolve its exchange between California currency, greenbacks, and there's some others. But I'm arguing that perhaps the cost of single payer in California could be relooked at in terms of how much health care does California provide for itself in a system in which its currency could circulate. And then if you need to buy pharmaceuticals from Novartis or something else, you need to find the greenbacks to pay them. But then, that's a different issue.
Get this into presentation mode. Just so I can flip through the slides. Does the So as we start to try to get this up, my talk will shift gears a little bit toward how we communicate, and in particular where we spend our energy in trying to reach the policy-oriented goals that we've described here. The interest, as you've heard in the previous couple of speakers, of an MMT approach is to have policy relevance. And the authority that generally has been brought to bear by people working within the modern monetary theory framework has been the effectiveness of MMT in showing a path forward and in addressing the public purpose. So in this talk, I'm going to distinguish between econometrics and statistical methods in general. And my question for us will be, what is the place of econometrics, the statistical tools that the economics profession had been using, aside from folks in MMT in particular? In order to do this, I'm going to delve into a little bit of intellectual history, and we're going to see that delving into some of these roots is going to make sense of some of the practice that we've actually seen from MMT economists. Now, this work is done jointly, as you can see here, with my partner Lihua Chen, who's not able to be with us. I'm also grateful to Mary Baldwin University, where one of my colleagues, whose course I'm teaching right now, also contributed greatly to completing some work that I had done on this in my dissertation. So we do have a few concurrent sessions going on here, so I have a special first slide when we get this up for those of you who might want to know, just want me to just cut to the chase and tell you what the take-home message is, in case you want to quickly have a look at the concurrent session before we get to questions and answers here. So I just undid your great work. Oh, there we go. Okay. So here's what we need to, here's the cutting to the chase. So if you are seeing stars, when you do your quantitative work, when you're talking to people about doing statistics in MMT, if you're seeing stars, there's something terribly wrong. And that's my little picture of the eclipse from this summer, and you can see stars, which was greatly disturbing to people in the past. Should be disturbing again here. To find what the roots of this are, we go back to when this project really started to take root here at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Before we had the name MMT, the way this project was referred to was as PKI, for post-Keynesian and institutionalist. And that's going to give us a hint. In fact, both Keynes and the original institutionalists had well-developed views on statistical methods. So we can look to answers in that lineage. I will contend that a methodologically consistent approach brings MMT closer to modern statistics than to econometrics, recalling the distinction I made for you at the top. The difference is one of attitude, and thus is a replacement, not a complement or a substitute, or not a complement or a reform of the practice that we would see in the mainstream curriculum, the previously mainstream curriculum. In order to trace this out, I'm going to go back prior to everything, prior to both MMT and econometrics, to the origins of statistics. And here I will very gratefully thank Judy Klein for calling my attention to John Grant's observations in the 17th century. So like Warren Mosler, I'm going to cast back that far. And what we see with Grant was that he was a merchant and had certain tools technical tools for solving problems in his business, that certain developments at that time prompted him to bring into policy analysis and policy advising. And the tools he brought were fairly basic. You saw Linwood describing similar tools in his indices when he was checking the properties of different indices. You can see that here in Grant's Merchant's Rule, which is basically taking one thing and comparing it to another in various ways to the end of policy advising. So what was the impetus driving him to go into policy analysis? Well, around the time that he was active, a problem was raging through England, and that was people were dying. Now, people had been dying for a long time, but they would have these periodic bouts in which, when you would have had one person a week dying, at some later point, maybe toward the autumn, you'd start to get 18 people falling over in the streets dying, the plague. The plague was a very pressing issue at the time, and this prompted Grant into policy advising and policy analysis. And in that process, he made an important innovation, an important conceptual innovation that, again, here Judy Klein has called to my attention. And that is, prior to this time, people really hadn't thought in terms of individuals. And Marx goes all the way back to tracing the concept of the individual and looking to ancient Greece, where we would think, well, democracy, maybe we had a concept of individual then. And he makes the argument that no, that was a slave-based society, and it didn't occur to them to think in terms of people who are in some sense homogeneous and comparable to each other. The plague had a massive leveling effect in that sense. You had princes and paupers falling over in the street just the same, and they didn't know why. When Grant started tabulating and adding up, we had essentially the creation of this concept of a homogeneous population in which we could sweep out and add up. So this is a very important conceptual innovation. But it was very practical. It was a problem-solving issue, and Grant was taking a problem-solving approach, and I'm going to end up using this as a philosophical term. Now, in the 19th century, as statistics started to further develop, we traced the origins of statistics to Grant. As it started to develop, people started to take the regularities that he was able to see in populations and started to treat them as entities of their own. Pearson here starts talking in terms of modern notions of chance, in terms of probability distributions, as opposed to an earlier medieval way of thinking of chance as just striking prior to these habits. Even beyond Pearson, the discipline of statistics became even more formalized under R.A. Fisher when Fisher derived optimality results for statistics like the indices and indicators that Linwood was talking about. But I write here in this slide that statistics became mathematized after Fisher, because after Fisher, people became even more mathematical to the point that Fisher criticized the excessive mathematization of statistics. There was, in the early 20th century, some rhetorical appeal to being very mathematical, and a certain subset of statisticians became enamored with that, drifting away from Grant's earlier problem-solving foundations. Economists got even more excited about that formality, but we'll get to that later. Keynes, by contrast, going back to those roots that we would like to elucidate, contended with the mathematicians. Klein describes Keynes as being skeptical of the use of probability distributions and statistical inference in the study of economic phenomena, and we can substantiate that in various ways. And I will strongly contend, and I see Lord Skidelsky is in the back here, that it was not for a lack of competence that Keynes was not interested in these approaches. On the other side, the original institutionalist side, we have philosophical foundations going back to Charles Sanders Peirce. He viewed chance, he had an idea of Tauheedism, which was chance precedes law. So this is contrasting to Pearson and the laws that he was starting to project onto Grant's regularities. This foundation of the individual was very important, again, starting to build up a coherent sort of summation of this philosophical approach. It also comported with a view of human beings as particle systems. And we might here think of econophysics. The approach says there are fixed laws in nature, and we contrast this with process philosophy. This will be the institutionalists and the Keynesians, which is evolutionary and problem solving. So to cut to the chase a little bit, these debates came to a head in the debate between Tinbergen and Keynes on the side of England, and between the NBER approach and the Cowles Commission in the United States. It addresses some issues that had been contentious here in the founding of MMT, which I'll skip past for now. But the point to take home from this is that there was an important difference between looking at the world as particle systems and looking at the world as processes. Going forward a little bit, so there are some arguments that are made in favor of econometrics that might say, for example, well, you know, we might have psychological traps. We're not very good at dealing with uncertainty, so we need these tools. We can deal with them by properly working with our data and using multiple techniques from the process philosophy perspective. Are we saying that you can't predict? No, I will make an argument that the over-mathematization has ended up directing a lot of our resources into work that isn't as productive as it could be. And that work is not about predicting or modeling, but rather a very specific portion of it, which is dealing with the properties of sampling distributions, where you've sampled from these fixed particle systems. So there have been some attempts to treat this quantitative side from within the milieu that was here in Kansas City. You may have heard of grounded theory, some of you. But the reason that I'm giving this talk is because I've found that some of these techniques, some of these approaches do deal with the question of looking at processes and not particle systems and grounding our concepts. But when we get to the analysis, we still see occasionally stars, even in the folks who are presumably doing a more consistent theory. So how do we get around addressing the issues that are generally addressed by talking about sampling distributions, which would like to be saying, how sure are we that we've seen something? Well, one way that we can convey our uncertainty is by sharing our data and sharing the software that we used. Reproducibility is a pathway that's an alternative to the econometric approach's strength there. A problem with looking only at sampling distributions for talking about the uncertainty in your work is that it neglects model uncertainty, which can swamp any amount of sampling uncertainty that you may be able to quantify with the theories of statistical inference in econometrics. So I have a little picture here. I have a much more complicated picture here to tell you that no, really, model uncertainty is an important problem, and it's not adequately addressed, statisticians say, with respect to both their peers and I would say econometricians. So what to do? Going back to the way things used to be, you can look at the data. This is 18th, 19th century ways of looking at the data that led to good solutions. Here's something that maybe had addressed the cholera epidemic in England. And we used computing back in the day. And this is Burns and Mitchell, original institutionalists, looking at patterns much the same way that Grant did, just a little more sophisticatedly. This is Keynes's side. Again, no problem looking at data. And now with computers, we can do this much more powerfully. So what does what does MMT approaches to quantitative methods look like compared to econometrics then? Here's a concrete example. Scott Fullwiler looking at the money multiplier. Okay, that's an MMT topic. And there were another pair of researchers, Carpenter and Demeralp, who looked at the same thing. So you look at the 2-week settlement period and you see what happens to the balances that that banks are keeping. And if there is no money multiplier, you should see something in particular. Carpenter and Demeralp measure. Fullwiler, I like to say, reads the authority's user's manual and doesn't have to measure. That's a big difference. When I talk about stars, here's what I mean. Generally, if you go to econ conferences, you'll tend to see a chart like this that has regression coefficients with stars on them. That's what I mean by stars. These 3 stars mean it's significant at a certain level. I would say if you're seeing this in MMT work, there's probably something wrong. What should MMT work look like? Okay, it should look like box plots, simple graphs that are close to the data. Because why? The concepts shift, but when you look at the data, if they're well specified, you can see it. Here's a simple bar graph, had a big policy effect in Harrisonburg, where I'm from. Rewrote the hiring policy. Another one, our incarceration rate, had a big policy effect just looking at the data. Here's another one that's a simple graph that had a big policy effect. Even more so, a simple graph, justifiable to the philosophical roots, policy relevant, and you can see here the policy effect in a small town in Harrisonburg where people were aware of MMT. You see Harrisonburg at the bottom being the capital of the resistance, voting overwhelmingly for one candidate who seemed to be somewhat aligned with MMT concepts that had been effectively messaged using these approaches. A teaser for my talk next time. Here's another graphic, totally consistent, totally proper to use, showing those votes off the map and how they compared to something nearly 130 years ago that I'll talk about next time.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. If the panelists wouldn't mind briefly perhaps restating the questions into the mic for the benefit of the online audience. Does anybody have a question yet?
Okay, thank you very much for your excellent presentation. I have a question with respect to use of observation, statistical data, which basically shows one dimension of the dynamical system. And as using method of time embedding technique, can reconstruct the dynamic of the system using that single set of observations. So what are your views on that subject?
So if we go into the tools that modern statistics has developed, they're very, very rich. And if we come to them from a good philosophical foundation, we can know how and why to use them. The econometricians have been interested in this as well, and they do make use of them. But the distinction with MMT will be that we will, for example, it would, for example, make you sensitive to the issues of dynamics that you're bringing up. The question was, how do we deal with observing dynamic data when we just have a one-dimensional slice? So in graphics, for example, there has been a lot of development in dynamic graphics. Now that's difficult for communicating in published form, but statistics is very much dealing with these issues, and we can draw from the leading edge of statistics to help us with tools for actually dealing with these things. Dynamic graphics in online environments are certainly an option. How we actually observe and measure, that's a methodologically more fraught issue. Keynes had this debate with Tinbergen, and it centered around this question of homogeneous populations. By homogeneous, what Keynes meant was back to Grant. Can you compare the lord and the peasant? Is your concept staying the same over time will become a problem. But if it is, I think that we have some modern statistical tools to handle that.
Is California beginning to issue its own currency? If that would, my daughter lives there. Would I have to then acquire California dollars of some sort if I went to visit and was hanging around in California? This
Well,
may seem like a simple, I'm just.
Yeah. There's an exchange rate issue, right?
There is.
But I would imagine that if you came into California with greenbacks, Californians would want to accept those greenbacks.
Sure.
Right? Maybe not the other way around, Californians going elsewhere. But if California at least has to pay its taxes, it has to acquire greenbacks, and it might as well get them from you as anyone else, you know?
And it seems such a radical solution though, to a national. Healthcare is a national problem. Do you think it's born of frustration in the states, or what's going on there?
Well, I think it's obviously a national problem, but yeah, my last slide was, you know, so goes California. If it can be done in California, then there is no reason that it can't be done elsewhere. Now, you know, California being a large state might, Vermont being a small state, it might not seem that you could do this in Vermont, but you know, the radical solutions, you know, problems require radical solutions. So let's say California and Vermont form a healthcare union. And so, you know, healthcare can be given to you know, folks in Vermont by use of California dollars in Vermont for those who are wanting to take it. I think these things grow organically, right? They're not going to grow certainly because the government is going to come and make it, you know, those in the government, Republicans or Democrats right now, are going to kind of make the right decision as to how these things happen. It's going to have to be some forward-looking entity, I think large enough, like California, and maybe California with New York and so forth and so on, that this grows. But you know, the bill was passed in the Senate. It got to the California Assembly, the House, and it was tabled because we can't pay for this. That's an issue that MMT has something to say about. Now, just because California is a state doesn't mean that we say, well, they're not sovereign in their currency. No, there are sovereign currencies popping up all over the place to deal with the issue of not being sovereign in your national currency. But I'm sovereign in the currency in my house.
But it might be actually an educational issue for raising the whole concept of a sovereign currency. People would start to think and talk about that,
Yeah.
whereas now it's a fairly strange and foreign concept to most people, I think.
But yeah, there's definitely an educational issue. Yes.
Following up on that, you could almost say that California is too large not to have its own currency. But your radical solution is that doctors are state licensed. So you could make a law in California that says you have to accept California script as payment in order to practice medicine in California.
And in order to get those doctors not to want to move over to Nevada,
Well, but
you just make it so that they can pay their taxes and then they're fine.
Well, but you could also, even if someone did move to Nevada, you know, you get too many plastic surgeons in California, and there's not enough doctors in the middle of the country anyway, so if a few of them leave, it actually helps the rest of the country.
Just the general MMT mantra is money is not an obstacle, you know, resources. If we don't have enough doctors, nurses, enough other things, then we can't do those things. If we have enough of them, then we can be able to find a way to provide a currency that can circulate to get them working. And
Maybe one more question?
The balanced budget must die.
Is an employer of last resort policy something that Euro area countries could enact unilaterally, or is it not possible under the current framework?
I don't think so. It could be introduced technically, but I think it will not. It will not happen in the euro area. It's a political point and a political evaluation.
Is it economically possible?
Yes.
Okay.
is another issue that MMT starts on the point that the state should control its strategic resources, right, Warren?
Okay, yeah.
And the Eurozone is a strange system where, yes, you can realize an employer of last resort program, of last resort program, but the states now have got strong limits on their capacity to control their strategic resources because they are put in the Eurozone system. But about the employer of last resort program, yes, could absolutely technically possible from tomorrow.
Is the political difficulty you see because all the European member communities, peoples will not agree on that, or gaining a consensus to do that is too difficult, or is it something else?
The point is that European people, large parts of European people think that austerity is right and that the states should act as as normal families. So they think that unemployment is due to is caused by states that spent too much in the past. This is the conceptual framework in Europe, and it's built on the scheme that is proposed by exporters that control the states that lead the policies in Europe now.
I was wondering when you were saying that European countries could have their own, could have an employer last resort program. I mean, are you saying, like they could do something like in California? So if it was France, that'd be emitting their own, another French franc that could be used to pay taxes, but not, anybody else who wanted to take it could take it. But its value would come from, let's say, paying taxes, so being exchangeable for payments of taxes. I mean, is that how you're saying they would do it?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, if you're saying like France, for example, could have an employer last resort program.
Okay.
So technically, what would they do to pay people? Are they paying in some newly emitted French francs, or
tax
they can't use the euro?
credits? They could issue tax credits and pay people with tax credits. Right.
Yeah. Well, the problem is that the European Union has said that will add to your deficit regardless of how to do it. So they're up against the 3% limit. So you can't use it to spend more than the tax or currency. And they just came out against federal currency category. Again, nothing happens.
Final word?
Yeah, they also have a treaty in the European Union prohibits certain kinds of local subsidies. So if France wanted to subsidize something, even if they want to do it in euros, they would have to subsidize it for everybody else who is a member of the European Union, which is not the idea.
All right, very good. Well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but let's maybe give one more round of applause for the